So this is an interesting occasion for me to debate my mentor's mentor here. And I'm sort of stuck between either trying to play the real debate game and take a hardline stance and argue my position with no compromise, and actually trying to find some common ground. So I think I'll decide which position to take as this plays out. So I think if if we ask, what do people expect out of trialists? The question we're asking is, do trialists have an obligation to share their data? The average guy, members of the public, educated members of the public, I think mostly are probably hip and in their understanding of trials, and would say, well, you've got to publish, and that means in a peer-reviewed journal. That's the standard for scientific dissemination of results. It goes through peer review, so on and so forth. I think the community here, probably in the audience, would say, well, we had that whole episode over the 90s that Dr. Scherer mentioned, and we really need more than just publishing, because if we just look at what's published, then we have this problem of publication bias. And so we really want to get the full denominator of all the studies that have been done. So we need registration and publication. And so I think that's sort of the standard that still exists among most people today. But over the last, say 3 years especially, there's been a very heightened and growing debate and discussion over whether that's really enough. And I posted this editorial that appeared in the New York Times earlier this year, in which it's titled, "Full Disclosure Needed for Clinical Drug Data." And so I think there is a growing sort of new support for a new standard, which is not just registering and publishing in a peer-reviewed journal, but also sharing the data that underlies all of that. So how did we get here, and why are there now calls for all this data? I think the biggest motivator of this demand is the erosion of trust in the biomedical literature. So yes, it was peer-reviewed, so on and so forth, but can we really trust what's there? And I just have, because of the time limit here, I just have one, I don't have, my time's not working. Just have one example to show you, which is the publication in JAMA of the peer-reviewed trial on Celebrex, right? Celebrex versus the NSAIDs. And the trial, if you can hopefully see in the underlined red portions, was reported in the JAMA paper as being a 6-month trial. And after 6 months, Celebrex was associated with a lower incidence of symptomatic ulcers and ulcer complications combined. And this was the drug's claim to fame. It's a safer drug. Not that it necessarily had better benefits on the efficacy side, but it was a safer drug. We then learned that actually the trial wasn't 6 months. It went on for a year. And at the time point of a year, there was no safety benefit. And so it's publications like this that have caused an erosion of trust in the biomedical literature, even of peer-reviewed journal articles. There's also been this issue of ghostwriting and access to data. And what do the people whose names appear and who get all the credit for the trial, what is their relationship with the actual data? So these are the two so-called pivotal trials that were used to get Tamiflu, the influenza antiviral, licensed by the FDA. These are the journal publications. The citations are on the left side. The journal publications of these two trials. Again, JAMA, Lancet, our best journals. And the lead authors on both of these papers are acknowledging that they did not have access to the primary data. One says he didn't have access. The other says, I don't recall seeing it. Again, it's an erosion of trust in the peer-reviewed journal publications. So why does this matter? Well, journal publications, I would argue, are sort of the basic unit that then goes on to have profound influence in decisions, either directly. Doctor reads a journal article, says, this is a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trial. Well, sure, this is good science, peer-reviewed. I should trust it and work on it. Or it gets filtered through systematic reviews, right? Top of the evidence-based medicine hierarchy. Systematic reviews largely rely on journal articles. They don't dig deeper than the journal articles. Sometimes they look for conference abstracts, things like that. But the granularity usually doesn't go beyond that, say, 10-page journal article. Guidelines as well, similar process. They're looking at journal articles. And so publications are very powerful with many downstream effects. And I think the access to data issue becomes so relevant here because the data is what underlies these publications. And so if we have access to the data, we potentially now have access to a mechanism for independent scrutiny of those clinical trials. The question is, what kind of data are we talking about? Right? This is where I think we'll probably have the most interesting discussions. What should be shared? If trialists have an obligation to share their data, what should be shared? Well, there's huge amounts of data that are collected and generated in the process of running clinical trial. Not all are just measurements that are recorded patient observation measurements. There's also analyses that are done. I would submit to you that those are types of data. We also have narratives. The protocol saying how the trial is going to be run is a narrative. Judgments. What about the Section 15, the records of the Data Monitoring Committee? Adjudication. Those are judgments. That's a type of data that I would say allows or helps allow us credibly assess, as independent reviewers, credibly assess what actually went on in that trial and what it all means. For the purpose of the debate, I wanted to circle those parts that I think are more universal and not specific. Some of these sections that I haven't highlighted are more specific to industry trials and what happens when industry trials are then submitted to regulators, in which additional amounts of data and documentation are generated. But the ones that I've circled in red, I think, are a place where we can start and discuss what we mean by sharing the data. That includes the study protocol, its amendments, the statistical analysis plan, blank copies of the case report forms, the manual of operations, informed consent forms, and records of the DSMB's judgments. So on the left-hand side, this is a slide that shows you the many reasons, I think, to share participant-level data. And on the left-hand side, third-party scrutiny is just one that I've been discussing up to now, but I think there's many other scientific reasons, as well as ethical and social reasons, why data should be shared. The correction of error, whether it's intentional error or unintentional error, can happen when more eyes see that data. We can also extend knowledge through more definitive meta-analyses, exploratory analyses of the data that the original trialists don't intend to run themselves. We can learn about unreported results. We can learn about how other people do trials so we can improve our own trial methodologies. There's also a basic ethical argument to be made for access to data, which is that there is a pact that's formed with the trial participants when they enroll in trials, that the trial is not just there for the benefit of the trialist or the trialist sponsors, but it's for the benefit of generating generalizable medical knowledge. And that can only happen, one can argue, when that data is shared widely and not limited to the original participants. We can also prevent harm. If we know what other people are doing and what happened in trials, we can prevent subjecting new trial participants to the same type of trial that would lead to the same results, potentially avoiding harm here. So I know that my opponent here is a fan of definitions, and so I figured I would try and figure out where our disagreements are, because I couldn't figure this out before. I started reading Trials Meinert's Way, some of the memos that are available. And so I want to share a couple slides to show you what I found. Trialists have an obligation to share their data. That's what we're debating today. Now, if the debate topic was trialists have an obligation to publish, I think there wouldn't be a debate, because as you can see from the quote, Dr. Meinert has said that the commitment to publication is not discharged until publication is achieved. So I think he would agree that trialists have an obligation to publish. So there's supposed to be something different between sharing data and publishing. But I kept reading, and I found another memo. Gotcha. 1 minute? Can do it. I think so. Okay. Another memo in which Dr. Meinert writes that finished data sets of trials should repose in public archives. And his argument is derived from the fact that, one, trials represent a form of public trust, as we mentioned, the ethical argument. Trialists have an obligation, so we have that word now, to maintain that trust. And one of the ways to ensure continuation of the trust is by repose of the finished data sets in public archives. So there must be something in the words share and data that we might have some contention over. And I'm not sure what to say about share. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as to grant or give another or others a share in. But in one memo, Dr. Meinert writes that sharing implies the existence of a partnership between the giver and the receiver where both stand to gain from the sharing. I think that would be an interesting thing to discuss. Okay. And finally, my last slide. Here's what I think about when the data should be shared, because I'm not in favor of the idea that once the last patient follow-up is done that day, everything should be public, immediate scrutiny, open your books, sort of hands up. Rather, I think that data should be provided to avoid a concept of trial abandonment, either at the time of publication or when trialists are no longer working towards publication. And sorry, I went over. Maybe you can give him an extra minute. Thank you.
Well, this is a setup. You know, how in the hell can I stand up here and talk about not sharing data when I've shared data all my life? So, you know, so I'm supposed to argue against that? Well, of course I believe in sharing data. The very first trial I did, the UGDP, before there was electricity, we put on at the National Technical Information Service the full patient listings of people in that study. So, yeah, I'm for sharing data, but I think the argument would come when and how. You know, I've said I didn't expect you to use my words to sort of try to attack me, but anyway, everything is fair in a debate. Well, first of all, I believe that engaging in research on human beings is a privilege, not a right. And I believe that when I undertake that, if I don't see it to the end, if I can, obviously sometimes you run out of money and so on and so forth, and you have a result either where the trial ends normally or where it's stopped because of reasons of safety or efficacy, I have an obligation to publish, and I don't think I've met that responsibility to those patients and to society until I've succeeded in doing that. Now, the problem is, of course, it's not as easy as it seems. I mean, I'm reminded of Alzheimer's prevention trial that we were engaged in, and we had to it took 5 submissions to 5 different journals to get those results published. So it's not an easy task. And I'm always sort of interested in the journals. When they came up with their registration idea, they're worried about selective reporting, and somehow or other registration is supposed to stop selective reporting. It's not clear to me how it does that, but you know, certainly half of the selective reporting is due to editors, not to authors. So it's a two-way street. So I certainly believe that if I do this, I have an obligation to publish, and I believe that until I've exercised that, I've failed with regard to the patients we've studied and society, and that's my first belief. Second, I don't believe that, I mean, an investigator is an investigator. And I don't believe that I can tell the difference between investigators who are funded by a drug industry versus investigators who are funded by the NIH. I don't believe, so therefore, this distrust that we have, especially with regard to, quote, drug companies and so on, I think is a little bit overblown. Now, obviously, there are examples of that you cite where there are things that go wrong, but you know, I think those are more the exception than the reality. If I'm funded by a drug company in this institution, my institution makes certain that I have unfettered rights to publication and to the data, or else they won't let me sign the contract. Now, you know, that would be true of most academic institutions, not all necessarily, but you know, the notion that somehow or other if I'm funded by a drug company, I'm sort of a pawn of the drug company or whatever. That's just false. Now, the issue, it seems to me, with regard to sharing, well, I believe what I said with regard to sharing. I think that the best form of sharing is a two-way street. I don't think it makes any sense for me as a researcher. In order to do this research, I've got to have approval of my IRB, and if I've got 30 other clinics, I got to have approval of those other 30 clinics to do this research. So I've got to go before IRBs. I'm accountable to IRBs. So any sharing that goes on, I want the people who are being shared with to go through the same process. I don't want to be sharing data with people who can just get it. So in other words, the term public access, well, that's a very vaguely defined term, but you know, certainly PubMed is a public access file. Anybody can get it. Back in Sleepy Eye, I can get it without having to do anything. I don't want a method of sharing where somebody can get those data without having to go through their IRB, without having to promise that they won't identify these people and so on and so forth. So the notion that somehow or other we should ultimately be providing data that's open to the public with no questions asked is just wrong, in my opinion. And why is it wrong? Well, first of all, it seems to me if I've gone to the work of trying to design this trial, collect this study, and so on, I ought to first of all have the first rights to saying what I believe about these results, and I ought not to be harassed into providing data before I'm finished with them. And what I see happening now is we've got procedures and methods that are sucking the life out of the need to publish. So, for example, if I'm doing an FDA IND trial, I'm supposed to put my results up there within 1 year after I've finished. Well, I don't know about any of you who've been involved in trials, but I'll tell you right now, it takes a fair amount of time after you've finished to finalize the data set. So the notion that somehow or other the data set is ready to be summarized and so on and put on that website within 1 year is just wrong. It takes on average about 3 years from the finish of a trial to publication, and we ought to have rules and regulations that are consistent with the first priority, namely of publication. So I believe in sharing, all right, but I believe there needs to be some restrictions on that. I wish that we would just stop talking about public access files. Well, if we mean literally by public access, it means that I can get those data without having to go through an IRB. I can just get them. I can go onto my computer and get a hold of them. Let's stop that talk, because I think it's dangerous. So if I'm sharing data, I want to know who has them, and I want to be able to interact with them. Now, I don't want to control what they do. It's up to them, but I want to have some interaction. I want to know what they're doing. They know what we're doing. I should know what they're doing. And furthermore, the problem with, quote, public access is that I want to know who has it because, for example, 2-3 years after the fact, I can discover that I've got errors in my data set. I can discover that there are people who aren't counted, or there are people counted wrong. Well, I ought to have the means of getting back. Somebody better have the means of getting back to those people to tell them about this problem. So let's forget about public access. I yield the rest of my time to the audience.
Now we have time for reading.
All right. Great. So we agree, and the debate is resolved. But then I guess maybe there are some places where we don't, and some sensitivities to the issue where I feel that I see them slightly differently. So I would put this out as a question, first of all. I sort of have this in the order you discussed. But Dr. Meinert mentioned that it's hard to publish. It takes time, and there's lots of rejection. So the process of getting your research out can actually be the holdup in dissemination of information. And I wonder whether that is somewhat a problem of people's ambitions, that they want the article to appear in a top journal, and so they'll therefore try top journals across the board before going to something that they're less happy with. And also whether the problem is somewhat resolved. There's some seats up here. Yeah. Whether the problem is somewhat resolved by the many journals we have now, like PLOS ONE or BMJ Open, which are not judging so much the relevance and importance of the study, so much as they're just judging its methodological and characteristics and whether it's been described properly. So it's more of a checklist of surface plausibility and credibility than it is a problem of importance. So I don't think the hard-to-publish argument works anymore. Whether there's a difference between industry and academia, and the point was made that perhaps some of these trials, like the class study that I showed in JAMA, these are more of one-offs. They're not the norm. They're more the exception. The problem is that the exception, even if true, and I'm not sure it's true, but even if it's true, can cause an incredible amount of damage. And so is that amount of damage something that we're willing to tolerate because the majority of people are more upstanding and there isn't any misreporting? I'd say I don't think so. And I think that science in general as a principle is about the sharing of data. It's not about the hoarding of data and only parceling out when somebody wants to. Now, whether institutions, the point was made that institutions only really should get involved in trials sponsored by industry when they have access to the data and rights over publication, so on and so forth. But I'm just curious whether the contract that investigators at academic institutions sign with industry actually allows them access to all the data from all study centers. Because one's not going to publish the data just from their study center. And whether that includes all the case report forms from all the centers, all the records of all the judgments made at the DSMB, so on and so forth. And I think the answer is overwhelmingly no, they don't. So they may, on paper, say you have the freedom to publish and we're not going to restrict those rights. But the actual data to do that work is most of the time not there. Sharing being a two-way street. I can see some relevance in this. And the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, has put out a draft proposal that will allow for the sharing of industry data. And an industry, because the EMA is the regulator in Europe and they only receive industry data. So it will allow the sharing of industry data with people at the participant level, the patient level data, with anybody who wants it, so long as they sign a contract that says that they won't re-identify, they won't use this for commercial purposes in another non-EU jurisdiction. So there are conditions, and I think I could agree to certain conditions that are extremely reasonable, but not the conditions where we vet who the right researchers are to do the research, and are they asking the right questions about the data. I think this is where you end up in a situation where there's way too much control over third-party access to data. data is hard to share. I have mixed feelings about this, and I haven't run clinical trials. The data I've shared have been much smaller studies, not clinical trials. But the mixed feelings I have on this are that I hear that from Dr. Meinert, Dr. K. Dickerson here, my mentor, that it is a lot of work to share data, and I believe that. But I think that just points to the need for upping everybody's game, upping the amount of money we have in this process so that we can share the data. Industry shares data routinely with regulators. They have to prepare their data in a way that's ready for a third party, also known as the regulator, to see that data. So I don't think this is an impossible feat. I think some institutions, like in industry, have been used to the concept of data sharing, except it's been on a closed circuit between them and regulators, which treat their data as confidential. And this question of right to primacy, and that it only once I'm done with the data, that's what a trialist should be entitled to say, that I shouldn't have to share it until I'm done with it. I think the question there is, when are you done? How do you define being done? And this is difficult. On my last slide, I had a proposal, and it has to do with the concept of being in touch with them and making sure that they're not en route to publication. And if that's not the case, then I think the time is up for sharing that data. Okay, thanks.
The first answer to your question is I'm done when I'm out of money. That's my operational definition of done. Let me just cover a few points here. I don't know, how many in this room have ever de-identified a data set? Yeah, well, it ain't fun. And on average, I guess I would estimate, at least for the way we do it, it takes at least a half a person year to do. Now, if I'm a drug company, maybe I've got people who are paid to do this, but if I'm funded by the NIH, that's usually an unfunded mandate. It usually comes after funding has run out. The expectation is that you de-identify and deposit it, and there's no money. So if we really believe in this de-identification stuff, it ought to be funded. So let's not just assume that it's drug companies. Now, Lee Dry gave me sort of guidelines for de-identification for a data set that we're working on. It says that, for polycotomous variables, values or groups should be collapsed so as to ensure a minimum number of participants. For example, at least 20 for each value within each race, sex cell. 2, continuous variables. Distribution should be truncated if needed to ensure that a minimum number of participants, for example, at least 20, have the same highest and lowest values in each race, sex cell. 3, dichotomous variables. Data should either be grouped with other related variables so as to ensure a minimum number of participants, for example, at least 20, in each race, sex cell, or deleted. Well, by the time I'm done de-identifying and following these rules, and I now supply it, I've supplied some fairly useless data to people. So, I think, again, I would say the best way to share is as a partner where you don't have to go through that stuff, would be my view. With regard to, you made the point before of sharing analysis. Well, I would submit to you that anybody who's ever been involved in writing a paper, at least 90% of the analyses that you do go on the cutting room floor. So the notion of, for example, supplying the analyses, or all the analyses, it just doesn't happen. Why do they go on the cutting room floor? Well, that doesn't work. There are too many assumptions here. There are all sorts of reasons why it goes on the floor. One point with regard to data sharing. I'm obliged to follow the IRB rules, and if I've got a trial involving 30 clinics, and at least here we don't have a centralized IRB. We've got if I've got a coordinating center and 30 clinics, I've got 31 IRBs I got to deal with. Now, if one of those IRBs has a statement in there that says data will not be shared, Can I go ahead and still share those data? Can I still go ahead and de-identify those data and put them out? I suppose technically, as Dave Shade reminds me, I suppose legally I could. But as a researcher, I wouldn't, because I would feel my commitment to those patients is greater than my need to supply de-identified data. With regard to the submission process, yeah, the hardest thing of all, it seems to me, in trials is writing papers. I mean, and the hardest thing about writing papers is getting started, and the second hardest thing is keeping going. And now, when you get to the end of the trial and you're running out of money, what are people doing? Oh, wow, we got to write papers. No, they're looking for other jobs. So the notion of sort of trying to make this go, and I've spent a lot of my career trying to get people to write papers and trying to get the paper business going. It is tough. So that's number one. Number two, I've never worked with a group that didn't want to publish in the New England Journal of Medicine. I don't give a damn what it is. It's always the first, that's always sort of the first journal. So yeah, there's always this desire to go to high-profile journals. And, you know, I think that's laudable. That's fine. That's good. But even some of the lower-profile journals are not a picnic. For example, we ended up with the trial I was referring to, the PLOS online journal. We had as much trouble there as we did with Lancet. So the notion that somehow or other those things are easier, it isn't true. Okay, they're waving the card at me. To hell with it. I'm done. Well, no, I'm not going to spend it.
Okay, so now it's your turn. So I'm going to ask both Peter and Kurt to stand up here, and you can fire questions at them.
Bring it on.
Okay. Okay, okay.
Does she want the mic?
Gentlemen endorse the new EFTIA on data sharing in clinical trials principles that involve their saying that what they will do is they will make patient-level data available within the kinds of constraints that usual data sharing occurs, where there will be contractual obligations, and where the people who you're going to hand off to are going to be people that you vet. You will not necessarily vet them yourself, as for instance the company, but you will comprise a board that will vet them, their bona fides, their capacity to do it, the questions that they're asking, and what their plans are for publication. And you will encourage them to publish, and you will post publicly who those people are, so that the public will know who is vetting who is making the decision that those data can be analyzed by another group of qualified people.
Do you want me to go first?
Well, go ahead.
Oh, right. Can I have the copy of it? There's a number of problems with. You have it here?
Here's a summary of it.
This is the one actually I was hoping for. Yeah. May I borrow it? Okay. So there's a number of problems. The first is that the boards that will do the vetting of who gets the data and who doesn't can be comprised. Essentially, you can have a board of 10 members, 8 of which can be employees of the company, and 2 of them can be paid consultants of the company, and that would reach the guidelines of the what they've said that the companies have to set up in terms of these boards, which some people think are independent.
Who they are, and the
Right.
public will then be able to complain or not complain about that. Is that right?
And to whom, though, are they going to complain?
Well, ultimately, complain to regulators, complain to Congress, sometimes things happen. Like,
Yeah.
for instance, we know the clinical trials registry, and it keeps getting more and more kicking in as to what needs to be posted and when.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I do think that the complaining part is potentially a powerful mechanism, but I don't really think it's likely to be a very powerful mechanism. But the other problems with it are that this principles document only refers to future trials, not past trials. So for all the medicines that we're taking today, this doesn't apply. So there's no commitment on access to data for those trials from the pharma EFPIA joint statement. The other thing is that there's a clear commitment here to share the data for trials that have to do with licensed indications, which means all the data for all the off-label uses for which there are clinical trials that have been done are not up for grabs. They're not on the table. They're not even, it's not a question about whether they'll share them or not. They're not going to share them. And that holds true. I would make a lot of changes, yeah. I don't like the document. I think it's more of the same.
I think it's not an unreasonable document. I mean, you can argue about the vetting process, and you always can, but you know, who knows the data better than the people who collected it? I mean, you can't imagine, until you've been in this business and doing trials, how many sand traps there are in data sets. And one of the reasons why 90% of the analyses go on the cutting room floor is, oops, there's a sand trap there and so on. So the notion that somehow or other you can put this stuff out and then it's okay to use, you got to know where the sand traps are. But you know, a question for you. You know, if you don't trust investigators, why should I trust you with the data that you get? Why are you any more trustworthy than me?
So you're saying I don't trust investigators to do what? Well, to publish accurately, honestly? I think
most of the, at least half of the impetus, it seems to me, with regard to getting the data and so on, is born of distrust. It's some of it's born of what you said up there. You know, you can find other things and so on and so forth. Yes, that's true. But at least half of it is born of distrust. I mean, obviously, they're hiding something. Obviously, there's something here. And if I could just get my hands on the data, I'd discover what the hell it is. So there's a lot of distrust. And you know, if this continues, and I agree, you've got celebrated cases that don't help any. But, you know, this whole enterprise, this whole research enterprise proceeds in the base of trust. And if trust is gone, we ain't got nothing.
No, I agree. There's a need to restore the trust. But I think if I don't trust you, meaning the trialist out there, I don't think there's a need for you to trust me. It should be about trusting the data. And so we should have the argument with the full presence of all the data available to argue over.
I know, but one of the things I put down as a note, another term that drives me up the wall is all the data. I cannot imagine any trial anywhere where people have all the data. I mean, there's megatons of data. You know, so the notion that sort of you get all the data, that never happens. Now, you know, again, so even when you come to the de-identification process and so on, you've got to proceed on the basis of trust because it's not all there.
Yeah, all the data is a shorthand, and that's why I put up a slide of about 15 types of data. And I think the point would be to slowly move down towards greater levels of granularity, and not that we have to define outright what all the data mean. I mean, there's obviously a ton of different types of data, but there's a way to move forward. I mean, if regulators, for example, have the concept that they can request all the data, right? They have the concept, and they put out the concept.
It's a meaningless term to me. Unless you define what you mean by that, I don't know what it is.
Well, I have put up a definition, at least, of 15 levels.
have a board, and I'm not arguing about the composition, but you've got to have a board that knows about the study, that knows about the data and so on. So in order to do their job, so I don't find it surprising that they include some of the people who designed or ran the study. I mean, I wouldn't trust that board absent that, but you know, I think as you pointed out, it's still accountable. So I think it's reasonable that it has some of those people there, whether or not how many.
Well, why do we need the board to begin with?
Well, we're talking about that.
Well, depending whether we agree with it. And why do we need a board to vet proposals?
Well, if you're going to vet, you're going to
Why
get
do we need
the Lord.
Do we agree? I don't agree we need to vet the proposals.
Well,
vet them for what?
You got to vet it so that you're satisfied, among other things, that they follow the rules, that they respect the rights of patients and so on. You can't just hand it out. You need some of that. Now, how much of it you need is another question.
Right, but if it's more about whether they agree to follow the rules, I think you don't need a complex board to figure that out. That's
Kind of the same line, but do you worry that, now privacy and security and all that stuff is more and more becoming an issue for people? Do you think that just in the future, if we have data and public, that it will make people less likely to participate in trials? Even if circumstances don't make scary, for example, if I join, work being a participant in healthcare trials, and if I know that they, were comparing this data with other people without letting me know, or that, they'll just tell me, oh, we're going to put it in public, I may be less likely to choose them.
when you say share the data, you mean share in a way that allows for somebody else to figure out who you are?
Yeah, identify. Obviously, it takes a long time to be identified. I'm not sure if it's going to be 100% be identified. There may always be some way of linking, information together. And there's just, it may be a worry, I may be worried and other people may be worried as well. I was just wondering what you do.
We'll have an unrepresented subgroup, which will be the people who have a fear of their data being shared and being re-identified. And I don't know if they have specific health characteristics or not, but those people may drop out of trial. It is true.
Well,
Does it mean that recruitment is zero? I don't think so.
The third rule of trials is that it's hellishly difficult to recruit, and you never get the number of people you want. So recruitment is always a problem. And yes, I do worry about that. You have these celebrated cases, for example, in Science last year, where there was this article that said, well, if you make the DNA data available, I can identify those people, and they did. I mean, so. I think if I'm involved in a trial where they're collecting DNA, I'm going to have second thoughts about that. There's the celebrated case of the Havasu Indian tribe, where they sued the investigators and ultimately won because the investigators went beyond, or people they gave the data to went beyond what the consent said, and the tribe was concerned about the data they showed about inbreeding. So, it's easy to talk about sharing data when you don't have to waltz in front of the IRB or whatever, but I don't want to have to do dances in front of my IRB before I go smell the roses.
I would like to make an argument against Dr. Meinert that mentioned that data should not be open. And I think that the most successful study, it's not a fund, and anything provides data on the web, open to everybody, and all data has hidden trust and standards. But the benefit has been enormous. We have hundreds of groups everywhere doing this analysis, and I'm not sure the motivation for a pharma company, but from public funding, I don't see no reason for not to have something like that or something bigger, because the benefit is incredible. challenge for the same effort, you get a whole community doing analysis, and sometimes it's hard because some of those people don't know what they're doing, but overall, the total result is amazing. So I don't see a very good argument against making sure that people can, as many people can have access to data, at least for public money.
Well, two things. One, we've spent by now millions and millions of dollars depositing data, in files and so on. I haven't seen really any papers that show us what we've learned from it. So, I mean, we do it, but I haven't seen much research on what we've learned from it. The other problem, though, the more fundamental problem with what you're talking about is what I referred to before, is if I put it out there like I do in PubMed, so that, it's there, anybody can get it without any restrictions. Well, I'm worried about the fact that these people are no longer obliged to follow any of the rules and regulations with regard to research on human beings. They don't have to pay any, they don't have any IRB approval, they don't have anything. And furthermore, if I discover that there are things in my data set that are wrong, I have no way of recalling it. I have no way of telling anybody about it. I mean, because I don't know who the hell's used it.
Same thing happens in
Same thing happens with
NCASE from time to time they find out that the variable was there were issues with measurements, so they post the problems and some things sometimes those are will corrected, other times will not. And I think one of them, I think now there are ways with electronic data sets, there are ways to do that. So if you identify an error in your data that is important enough that affects the result, that to PubMed, and now there are ways to on PubMed. So there would be ways that people would know if they eventually look at this application. So I mean, everything has advantages and disadvantages, but the possibility of having really community people working on the data is very important.
So this is a specifically for Peter's question. With regard to selective outcome reporting, when you do a clinical trial and you write a proposal, you are supposed to pre-specify all your outcomes to avoid the sort of data exploration that results in, statistically significant results that are that are really not clinically significant. If you give this data to everyone and there's no sort of registration or proposal or whatever, they don't pre-specify their outcomes, is there a way to sort of avoid this type of error in their outcomes?
No. I mean, you're saying if they basically do the same thing and they don't declare, are they going to have any better results? No. I mean, they're doing exploratory analysis. The point is you can make the same criticisms about that secondary analysis as you made of the primary one, which is this is selective outcome reporting. These guys didn't have a protocol that predates the analyses they did. There's no evidence of it. So you can make the same criticism. Another bad paper can come out, but we've had bad papers in the past. Bad papers are part of science. Criticism is part of science. So I don't see that as a big stumbling block that you can have. People can do poor analysis. It's always been the case.
Could I just make a comment on the pre-specifying? That's another. I hate all pre-words. I mean, I've banned all of them. I mean, and because pre-specify. Again, I'm back to the first study I did, the UGDP. Well, we ended up stopping the trial because of mortality difference against one of the drugs. But the argument that the critics made was, well, we didn't specify mortality as the outcome, therefore you had no business stopping the trial. So I mean, you can pre-specify all you want, but sometimes there are surprises, and when you have a surprise, you ignore it. You say, well, we didn't specify mortality, so we'll just keep plowing on. No, I don't think so.
Is data sharing in that context is very, very different in terms of who's going to be incentivized to do what kind of activity on the basis of sharing or not sharing. And you're certainly going to chill a lot of industries which sponsors a huge amount of interventional research by trying to say, because it works in this context, it will also work in that context. And I think the incentives are very different, the rules need to be different as well.
Yeah, but not because of fund, the fund. So I think the public funded plan. So there's no basic difference between public funded plan.
Perhaps it really, I think one would have to take a much closer look at that question to see what the differences are before making a pronouncement.
Yeah, I have one. Be careful.
Of what?
I mean, because, as I said, I don't want to have to do a dance in front of my IRB before I'm done. So I'm going to be quite conservative with regard to a lot of these things.
Okay, we'll join you in thanking our speakers.